have Western ideas and Western concepts. I have a strong affinity for St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas and Martin Luther.
Wait a minute. But St. Thomas Aquinas does not teach justification by faith alone. Your own goofy tradition says that that is the gospel. That's the linchpin upon which the entire gospel hangs, Luther said. But now you're saying, no, you can be a saint and achieve heavenhood if you're Thomas Aquinas. But Thomas Aquinas taught the necessity of works of supererogation. St. Thomas Aquinas taught absolute divine simplicity, the papacy, and all of these things that you think are a denial and corruption of the gospel if you're faithful to your own Lutheran historical tradition. But as you can see, this is a moving and shifting position where every single Protestant is allowed to pick and allow into heaven whoever he happens to have a pet like for. So in the case of Aquinas, we'll give him a pass because he wrote these big fat theological books and he had a high IQ. So he gets into heaven. Calvin? Does Calvin make the cut or what? Like, what's the principle here? The principle is really just whatever the individual Protestant wants and likes. Now they're going to say, it's the gospel. It's the free teaching, the free grace of God. No, but Aquinas doesn't teach the free grace that Luther teaches. So notice the hypocrisy of these people where they want to give the appearance of this sort of, ecumenical, accepting. Aquinas is part of the saints. He's one of the saints that I will allow into heaven as I sip my pumpkin latte and play with my Star Wars figurines. Yeah, but that's hypocritical. It's inconsistent. It makes no sense.
And those who are part of the Western tradition. Not that I don't also have an affinity for many in the Eastern tradition. I certainly do.
So notice in these people's minds, it's just these schools and traditions that we can all appreciate. And so Protestantism at its root is fundamentally ecumenist. Note that the ecumenist movement, of course, comes out of Anglicanism historically. So ecumenism is a fundamentally Protestant notion. Yet Protestantism at the same time has this dialectical issue where they have to kind of not like ecumenism because the gospel is very precise. If you're a classical Protestant, it's the 5 solas, right? Sola gratia, sola fide, sola scriptura, etc., etc.
It's that antipathy toward anything Western that leads a lot of orthodoxy away from any kind.
By the way, this isn't actually true. It's an opposition to Western errors. There is no opposition to everything Western. So this is a mischaracterization that these people do all the time of Orthodox theology. And it really has nothing to do with antipathy to the West, unless we mean the errors. And I went into great detail, for example, in the long stream I did critiquing Father John Romanides, who is probably the most anti-Western, but even he is not completely anti-Western. Right, so this is not really the case. It's just one of these kind of like throwaway arguments that these people do all the time.
Forensic language, and
by the way, we do forensic language. We talk about it all the time. Athanasius talks about it. It's in our liturgy. So there's nothing wrong with the forensic language. We're just very cautious about not adopting the Augustinian misunderstandings, such as the idea that everybody sinned in Adam. That's wrong. That's not what the Greek says. It's everyone sinned because of Adam, not in Adam. You see how crucial that is? Because in Augustine's mind, that means everybody is in Adam as in an archetype, and everybody is guilty because of Adam's action, and the guilt is transmitted. Inherited guilt is the crucial idea derived from both Platonic philosophy and from his misunderstanding of what that text actually says. And so guess what? You're more of a Neoplatonist than we are, because you're agreeing to the Augustinian archetype doctrine of original sin.
That's just clearly language in Paul. I don't think you can get around the fact.
Again, nobody disagrees with the language, but it's your presuppositions as to what the words mean.
That there is so much legal language surrounding justification, language of judgment, language of acquittal, language of guilt.
Okay, I'm going to skip this because nobody disagrees with that.
Yeah, the East is going to focus on the kind of theosis language that shows up, which is certainly there and a big theme in that.
So the fun thing with the serpent is,
like, these two, are these the same guy?
What, and not only that, but why is the serpent's
like this
punishment to
annoying
crawl on its
professor
belly
who
when
comes
that's
on
what
who
it
I
does?
can't stand? right? I've made fun of this
If
guy
you
for. It's like
don't know
these
how
guys.
to read biblical poetry,
It's like these guys should be in the
if you don't
same
know the formal
sect together.
qualities of
particular work. But there's also language of debt and a debt being repaid. He speaks about mankind.
Yeah, again, I mean,
as-
we've covered this ad nauseum. I mean, John Damascus uses, legal language. And so the fact that some Orthodox apologists at some point might have said bad stuff, so what? Like the Eastern Fathers use legal language. That's not the problem. The problem is, do you have a nominalist reductionist understanding of these words such that you think that in the ancient medieval world there was this nominalist idea of pure legal standing without ontological change or transformation? And that was not true. It's very easy, in fact, to debunk that the ancient and medieval world, including all the church fathers, never had any nominalist medieval conception of divorcing things from the reality, or words from the reality, or status, legal status, from the actual ontological reality. And your position hinges on that divorce. So you don't even know that.
That means in terms of his De Trinitate, or his treatises on the Trinity, which is a very large book and complex one. And this is at the root of a lot of East-West debates in terms of the idea of the procession of the Spirit. So there's that, and that's a...
Okay, so, but why, as a Lutheran, are we supposed to accept or submit to the authority of Augustine as amongst any other church father? I mean, ironically, wouldn't we? If we were, wouldn't it be more consistent if you're a Protestant to think that the early church fathers in a council might have a little more authority than one guy? Or maybe it wouldn't. Maybe Protestants are already proto-Protestants in the picking out of the single dude amongst the church fathers that they want to follow, because it agrees with their presuppositions. And I did this too when I was an Augustinian as a Protestant. I did the exact same thing. But then it occurred to me when I listened to Dr. Bo Branson, well, at the Second Ecumenical Council, the church accepts ecumenically the teaching of the Cappadocians on the Trinity and not Augustine's theology. And if you read on the Trinity and you read all of the Cappadocian writings on the Trinity and Christology, you will see that they don't teach the same thing. And the church accepted not the Augustinian view. So you have chosen, which is the essence of heresy, is to pick and choose what you like in the church fathers, and by the way, what you like in Scripture. And that's why Lutheranism and Calvinism are heresies, is because it's all about picking and choosing. That's what the word actually refers to.
Complex issue that I really can't unpack here, but I will say I am indebted to the Augustinian tradition in terms of understanding of all sorts of things. So the Trinity.
So I think that we got different things that are going on tonight, so I'm going to have to probably cut this short. I'd like to get into the rest of this video, but I can't imagine that he's going to be any better on icons, because that's the only thing left. So he goes from Augustinianism to talking about icons, and I'll remind you guys that tonight we have the other crazed haggard man, or Tristana, and his beautiful sister Chastity, I think is her name. Chase is about to debate the doctrine of the deity of Christ in 1 hour. Actually, we have some time. Jamie, when are you recording? Oh, okay, so we got time. Actually, we can finish this out. And then we got time for the super chat. So I'll charge it. So let's finish up his. Let's see what he says about Augustinianism.
Is one of those,
and we'll do the super chats, and we'll have time for chat from the Discord as well. So tonight I'm taking Q&A from Discord, which is, we got an audience in there. So let's see what else he says about Augustinianism.
And another one of those aspects that I'm very much indebted to St. Augustine on is his view of original sin. And within Eastern Orthodoxy, there is a lighter view of original sin. There is an emphasis on the freedom of the will, or human synergy in conversion. And I simply don't see that in the New Testament. So I do take...
Right. So you don't see synergy in the New Testament, which literally has Paul saying that we are co-workers with Christ, right? We are co-workers with God. The synergeia actually comes up, right? And you don't see that in the New Testament. Well, that's because you have presuppositions about what the New Testament teaches. And notice he keeps saying the New Testament, the New Testament, the New Testament. I mean, there's this implicit Marcionite argument here, or dialectical Marcionism implicit in Lutheranism, which always shows up. We see it very clearly in Luther. I've read a lot of Luther over the years, and you'll notice, for example, in his Bondage of the Will treatise, he says that your will is either determined by God directly or determined directly by the devil. Now later Lutherans, it's a little too harsh, we better soften this. They don't totally agree with that. But the origin of their sect is a guy who literally makes Manichaean arguments that your will is either literally determined by Satan or God. That's a dualism. And so he would rather have his stupid dualism and Manichaeanism by his denial of any synergy in the New Testament. Now, maybe he'll say that after justification, there's some little degree of synergy, but of course it has to have nothing to do with your salvation. So again, this invention of the idea that you can have a legal status divorced from the real ontological status. That's what I mean by nominalism. And that's why Luther, according to his own Lutheran theologians, Heiko Oberman, Harvest of Medieval Theology, Heiko Oberman, Harvest of Medieval Theology, Heiko Oberman, Harvest of Medieval Theology, demonstrates that Luther could have never had Lutheranism without medieval nominalism. Did you hear me, slow boys? Did you hear that? And how is that the case? Because he needs to divorce the ontological reality of being righteous and justified from the legal standing. That's a presupposition, a philosophical assumption that all of the Protestant sola fide justification doctrines hinge on. And because these goobers don't actually study philosophy, they just read their theology texts, or actually in his case they don't, they play with figurines and put them in front of their pristine texts that are never opened. They don't know the actual philosophical assumptions at work in Luther, which their own Lutheran theologians write gigantic treatises about. So guess what? If Heiko Oberman's thesis is correct, and I think he is, then it's impossible that anybody prior to Luther taught a nominalist doctrine of justification. That destroys his whole paradigm and worldview and sect. And that's why he's so ferocious and mad and seething when he's invited to come speak and has to say that we're bad people who question authority. Didn't your heresiarch Martin Luther start his church by questioning authority, Dr. Soy Cooper?
Augustinian perspective on those issues. And I would kind of go to a more moderate Augustinianism, someone like St. Prosper of Aquitaine, the Council of Orange, more so than I would a strict Augustinianism like you find in someone like Thomas Gottschalk, or later within Calvinism, though Augustine.
He's just throwing out names to give the appearance of sophistication and like he knows all the theology of these people. And I can already tell that like he's throwing out words that he's all gotten from secondary sources. He hasn't actually read these people.
Calvinism are not, they're not equivalent. Augustine has disagreements with Calvinism, I think, as well. But in terms of a harder, a double predestinarian stance or things like that. But the Lutheran tradition in general has grabbed onto a more Prosperian, Prosper is quoted in the Augsburg Confession, but it's attributed to St. Ambrose. But without knowing that St. Prosper of Aquitaine is this really major figure because of a particular book that he wrote on the Call of
we don't care about the later Lutherans that you like.
We do have to.
Augustinians.
It's very clear that that's the case, but you do have this other more Augustinian strand, and I think there are figures other than Augustine who do have this strong view of something like original.
No, so the authority that he says I denied is the official stories on anything. So understand, this guy is a total normie. And when he was invited to come and discuss in a very civil, polite way, again, his response was that we are all bad people because we question authoritative mainline normie narratives on anything. Kufid, anything. And that's why this guy pushed the stabbies and was virtue signaling about it. And of course, talking about how bad we are, right? So, no, I don't feel bad making fun of these kinds of people because these people are intellectually dishonest, slimy people, right? I mean, when we reach out to these people and we're always polite and kind, invite them to have discussions, it doesn't even have to be debates. They almost always resort to this kind of underhanded activity and try to undermine what you do. And he was saying stuff that he thought would get me deplatformed. That's why he was saying that. So I'm not going to say what, you can kind of guess what types of events, big nine types of things. If you question those things, or you're just a bad person.
Sin, you see it in St. Ambrose, who of course is going to have a major impact on St. Augustine. So I do follow the Western tradition in terms of the doctrine of original sin because is clearly taught, in my perspective, it is taught in the New Testament, and it is especially consistent with the theology outlined by Saint.
All right, images, icons.
I use iconography. I think it is beneficial, but the way that it plays out in Eastern Orthodox spirituality, the sacramental nature of icons, and just the centrality of iconography in Eastern Orthodox spirituality is something that I just don't see in the earliest church fathers. So while I see iconography as useful, I don't see it as something that is necessary. And in Eastern Orthodox spirituality, it really has been elevated to the level of it being necessary. Now, the reason I say it doesn't really fit with the earliest Christians is that when you read the apologists, you read Justin Martyr, you read Anaxagoras, you read others, they're pretty clear that there aren't really images in worship in the early church. Now, we do have some mosaics, we do have images.
So they're clear that there aren't images, but we do have images in mosaics. So he just contradicted himself right there, that there were images in the early church, but this is an argument from silence. The fact that that they don't talk about, quote, images, and by the way, that can mean different things. They might be saying that we don't have statues, or we don't have 3D representations, or we don't have pagan images. So if Justin Martyr is writing to defend the church against the accusations of pagans, of course he's going to say something like, there's no idols, there's no statues, there's no images in that sense in the church. And some people thought there were, right? A lot of the early Christian accusers claimed that Christianity was this sect that engaged in all kinds of pagan practices and degenerate practices. So he's brushing past this as if we know exactly what the context is, but it's also an argument from silence. And then he turns around and says, but there were mosaics and images. But I thought you said that they said there weren't. So actually, modern liturgists and liturgical scholars have gone into the history of this and shown, oh, actually there were images very early in the church. And the very principle of the Eucharist itself and the church's teaching on the real presence is a form of iconography and imagery. The early presence of relics is another principle and proof of iconography, because the same principle behind a relic is the same principle behind an icon, which is the immanent divine presence. And so he's just brushing past that as if, and this is another mistake, by the way, this is actually a fallacy that a lot of Protestants engage in, which is that I don't see an explicit treatise on images prior to the Seventh Council, so there weren't images. Do you realize that that's a fallacy? So the fact, for example, that we don't see an explicit treatise on what the canon of Scripture is does not mean that there was not a canon of Scripture in a loose sense, or that they weren't using text or didn't have a collection. There wasn't a final canon of Scripture until much later in the history of the church, right? The Sixth Council. But the church had a loose canon. They had some books, they had collections, and they might have differed throughout the empire. So likewise, just because we don't see an argument in the 2nd century about inhypostatize or inhypostatization, which is a big point of debate at the Fifth Council, does not mean that the idea wasn't there or it wasn't taught. And in fact, the contrary is the case, where we do see the principle of these things taught. Now, if you remember in the Trent discussion, Trent said, Jay, you can't make this argument consistently because you said there's no clear argument for the papacy. No, that's not what I said. There are statements in the first 1,000 years which papists use to prop up their presuppositions. But what I said was that there's not a Vatican I statement in the first 1,000 years, which is what they need to prove, given the fact that Satis Cognitum says that it was always the view of the church to have this papal view. So again, let's be clear, 2 different arguments to be precise. So trads, you can't call me out on that, because I'm not saying that the papacy is false because there's no clear doctrine of the papacy prior to the first 1,000 years. There are papal statements, but they are interpreted to mean something like Vatican I way later, right? And those papal statements can be read in an Orthodox way as the first see amongst many, or the first see in a canonical privilege way, and not necessarily Vatican I. So again, a lot of this is bait and switch terms that are used in the apologists, the Roman Catholic apologists. But let's get back to Jordan.
Up rather early, but the church as a whole certainly did not see images as so central in the worship and theology of the church. And so images...
Well, he's just arguing from silence, right? So the fact that there's not a clear statement is also ignoring the principle of tradition, which is that there's oral tradition and that there's handed down liturgical tradition. So we might make the same argument about all manner of things and undercut his own view. So in other words, I could use his same argument as a Protestant against him about the canon of Scripture. I could argue, oh, so are you going to use this same argument that there's no canon of Scripture that's clear and precise in the first 500 years? And so therefore, no one should believe in the canon of Scripture. Oh, by the way, that's what later Lutherans actually did. Later Lutherans at Tübingen and these liberal German higher critical schools that are the descendants of Luther and Lutheran theology, what do? They used this same principle and said, there's not really any reason to believe in a fixed canon of Scripture. Where is the canon of Scripture in the first 500 years? Oh, well, so it's not really necessary. So on his own grounds, apply his argument to his sola scriptura presuppositions, and let's see if it holds. It doesn't.
Were used for instructive purposes in certain places. In other churches, it seems to be that there were not really images used, to the point that we have the Synod of Elvira, I believe, which condemned the use of images. Now, I'm not saying that we should condemn the use of images, but the point is the early church does...
Well, this is funny because many of the reformers did condemn the use of images. So it's nice to see some admission from classical Protestants that what's so clearly idolatry, according to the Calvinists, oh, wait a minute, it's not really a clearly idolatry, right? Because Luther didn't have a problem with images. He didn't think they were necessary. I think they were adiaphora, but notice that I thought, we would think that if the Scriptures had perspicuity, the perspicacity of the Scripture, they're so clear, right? The Scriptures are so clear, especially on moral things. Well, then how come between Luther and Calvin, we don't even know what constitutes idolatry?
To have this very strong view of whether or not images are necessary. So,
well, I like the comment, by the way, in the audience there. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Maximus, that iconoclasm is fundamentally Gnostic, and it requires a little bit more of a going into to cover how that is. I've done multiple streams on iconographic philosophy and theology. You can go watch those streams. We did one with Sneck that's about 2 or 3 hours. I did one on my own that's about 2 or 3 hours. So I go into a lot of depth on that very point, which you guys can go watch. But it is important to point out this Gnostic element because we'll give some props to the Roman Catholic apologists, because several years ago, I think Dave Armstrong, the normie Roman Catholic apologist, he dug up some documents and papers that proved the influence of Hermeticism on Luther, specifically things like the Theologia Germanica. As we mentioned earlier, Heiko Obermann notes that Luther was very influenced by nominalism. So we have Hermetic, esoteric, Neoplatonic influences on Luther. Uh-oh. I thought you were calling out Neoplatonic influences, Dr. Cooper. Hanging with Dr. Cooper.
They are used and they can be useful, but in the sense that they have this central role within Eastern Orthodox spirituality, I don't see that in the early church. And I think that if they were that central and they had that...
So as a Protestant, are we now supposed to believe that there is a principle that we do follow what we see in the early church? Okay, where are the Lutheran bishops and ecumenical councils if we're supposed to follow what's in the early church? Because you just said we should follow the things that are in the early church. At least I heard you say that, but maybe you would qualify that with what's in Scripture. But where in the early church do we find sola scriptura? Oh, we don't. The church fathers don't teach sola scriptura. They teach that Scripture has a very important role, but without a fixed canon, which comes centuries later, there's no sola scriptura.
Kind of theological and spiritual import.
And by the way, I will recommend to you 2 important Protestant scholars who, throughout their books on the history of the formation of the canon, point to and admit the crucial role of church tradition in deciding what's in the Bible. So this is prior to the Bible. It's the church determining what's in the Bible. Two Protestant scholars whose books admit this and will convince you that tradition is necessary for the Bible. F.F. Bruce's Canon of Scripture and The Formation of the Christian Biblical Canon by Lee MacDonald, both evangelical Protestant scholars.
That would have been somewhere in the New Testament, but it's really just not even a concern.
So he thinks images aren't in the New Testament. The word icon is used multiple times in the New Testament. The principle of iconography comes from the New Testament usage of icon. We are the icon of God. The Father has his direct imprint and image and icon in the Son. All of creation is an icon in a way of God. It is made also in his image. So all New Testament theology, especially the Pauline cosmic theology, which is where Maximus derives it, is iconographic. And if he had actually read like the argumentation of the Seventh Council from St. Theodore the Studite or from St. John of Damascus, he would know that this argumentation is from Paul. So the principles of iconography are simply Pauline, and the philosophy that Paul has in his epistles, that all things exist through the Logos. The Logos is the icon of the Father, and all things exist as the principles based on the ideas of the Logos, the Logi doctrine. The Logi doctrine is from Paul. It's not made up.
One way or another, so it's not really that relevant. So that's not to say I'm an iconoclast, but the kind of centrality and the sacramental nature of iconography that's in Eastern Orthodoxy is
right.
Not.
So you are cool with Star Wars soy figures, right? That's a cool iconography, but you don't want to look at the images of the saints who are deified in the liturgy. Well, I think that tells us what we need to know about this religion.